So welcome everyone to the second Schulman lecture in the humanities for metaphysics meets cognitive science. Today, I'm super pleased to welcome philosophy's rock star, and that would be Professor David Chalmers, who is University Professor of Philosophy and Neuroscience at NYU. So Dave is a philosopher, but also did his PhD in philosophy and cognitive science at Indiana University with Doug Hofstadter. And he also does a lot of collaborative work with neuroscientists and cognitive scientists. So he fits right in with our venue. So, I mean, Dave is a rock star, partly just, well, in all ways, shall we say. So his work is obviously that way. He's known for both, I think, advancing really interesting, speculative, controversial new ideas. And also he has, one of the things I love about his work is he has an eye for understanding deep philosophical questions and how to frame them, both in distinctive new ways and also in ways that kind of even like conventional philosophers can grasp and understand and engage with. He's also looks like a rock star, which I really love. He's got the hair. And when I first met Dave, he had even longer hair. I was an impressionable, very stressed out grad student in an American Philosophical Association meeting. Dave was in what was called back in the day, the Smoker, which is this horrible event, which I will go on with you later. But for all of us that were graduate students, we were all traumatized. And Dave, one of the outstanding things about him is that he's incredibly like welcoming and supportive of new people in the field and engages in really productive conversations with them. And he did that for me. And it was probably the first time I'd ever had that happen. And I felt so welcomed. That's my primary memory of Dave, but that has continued. I've known him for a long time. And he has always been that way with me, with other philosophers kind of who are kind of getting into the field, and also with obviously with more senior people and people who are kind of full on engaged with all of the major topics in the area. So he's really a leader in all ways. And I guess I will not keep going on, but I could. Let's just welcome Dave. He's going to speak to us about the meta problem of consciousness. Thank you.
Well, such a pleasure to be here with old friends and new talking in this this series. I'm going to be talking about, well, as Laurie mentioned, I went to my advisor in graduate school in philosophy and cognitive science at Indiana University about 30 years ago now, was Douglas Hofstadter. I don't know how many of you have read Hofstadter's works like Gödel, Escher, Bach, and so on, but he was particularly fond of the meta perspective to almost any problem. I mean, there's this slogan which is sometimes attributed to him: anything you can do, I can do meta. He denies that it was him, and there's actually a long trail of interesting history for that very slogan that I won't go into. If you go online, actually, you can find a meme attributing this to Immanuel Kant, which is not especially plausible. But the idea today was, okay, to think about making progress on the problem of consciousness. Maybe one form of progress can be achieved by going meta, by jumping out of the system, going up a level. And that's going to be what I'm going to try to explore in what follows. Okay. So when I was actually in graduate school, I went to a talk where they told me that meta X always means X about X. So metacognition, cognition about cognition. A meta theory, it's a theory about a theory. Okay, of course we immediately set about finding counterexamples and, okay, metaphysics. Is that physics about physics? No, not really. Meta-ethics, is that ethics about ethics? No, not really. But this one actually fits the template. The meta problem of consciousness is so called because it's a problem about a problem. And the meta problem of consciousness, as I understand it, is to explain why we think and say that there's a problem of consciousness. My thought is that's a distinctive approach to the problem of consciousness that might itself be productive and interesting. I've been told I need to go exactly 45 minutes, so let me make sure I've got my timer in hand. Very good. Laurie is fully authorized to cut me off at 45 minutes and 0 seconds. Yeah, I need that stopwatch for the second hand now. But, okay, so the meta problem is a problem about a problem. That presupposes a first-order problem about consciousness. And in this context, that problem is the so-called hard problem of consciousness. So I think we said I was going to take my mask off, right? If that's, I gather the convention is for speakers to remove the mask and audience to keep it on. If anybody is uncomfortable and prefer I put it back on, just let me know. The hard problem of consciousness is the problem of explaining why and how physical processes give rise to conscious experience. Here, okay, so here's an illustration of the hard problem, which I quite like, because it somehow illustrates consciousness as someone's hair catching fire. This is maybe some kind of illustration of the magic of conscious experience. But the hard problem is concerned with what philosophers often call phenomenal consciousness, which is basically tied to what it's like to be a subject. So, this locution goes back at least to a famous paper by my NYU colleague, Tom Nagel. In 1974, he wrote, "What is it like to be a bat?" And the thought was, although we don't know what it's like to be a bat, say engaging in sonar, is it more like vision, is it more like hearing, but presumably there's something it's like to be a bat. A bat has subjective experience, just as there's something it's like to be me, there's something it's like to be you. We assume something it's like to be a bat. Most people would say nothing it's like to be, say, a cup or a water bottle. There's something it's like to be a system, roughly when it has some kind of subjective experience. So we say a system is phenomenally conscious if there's something it's like to be it. A mental state is phenomenally conscious if there's something it's like to be in that state. So states of phenomenal consciousness include visual experiences, like the experience of color and depth. There's something it's like to have those experiences. Other sensory experiences, like of sound or taste. Bodily sensations, like pain or orgasm. Mental imagery, like recalled visual images from your childhood. Emotional experiences, like happiness or anger. Or indeed a stream of a current thought, like reflection and decision, all sometimes thought of as elements of this rich inner movie of consciousness, states that feel like something to the subject. The locution, the hard problem, is meant to contrast with other problems of consciousness and of cognition more generally, the so-called easy problems, which aren't easy in any absolute sense. They're as hard as any problem in science, but they're called the easy problem because we've got some at least better grip on how to go about explaining them. These are basically problems of explaining behavioral or cognitive functions, like, say, perceptual discrimination, the integration of information in the brain, the control of behavior, and indeed verbal reports, like saying, I see that object now. These are all, relatively objective features of the human system. We have a fairly standard paradigm for explaining them in cognitive science. Roughly, we handle the easy problems, these problems of explaining behavioral or cognitive functions, by finding a neural or computational mechanism that performs the relevant function. Maybe a neural system, maybe some kind of algorithmic mechanism, but once you've explained how it is that that function is performed, you've explained the problem. But for the hard problem of consciousness distinctively, it looks like explaining all those objective behavioral cognitive functions seems to always leave open a further question. Why is all that accompanied by experience? Why is there something it's like to undergo those processes? Why doesn't all that processing go on in the dark, without consciousness, as it might in, say, a robot or a zombie? there seems to be what philosophers call an explanatory gap here between physical processes and subjective experience. So that's the hard problem. Here's an illustration of something very strange happening in the vicinity of the brain and consciousness that we're trying to get to the bottom of in solving the hard problem. And there are many different approaches to the hard problem, in coming both from the side of metaphysics and philosophy, or from the side of the science of consciousness. I mean, there are approaches that take consciousness to be irreducible in nature. And this is actually the side which I have somewhat more sympathy for, and that I've argued myself in some earlier work, that consciousness could be fundamental and irreducible in the same way that space and time and mass are often taken to be. This leads you to views like dualism. Consciousness is distinct from any physical properties, but is somehow in interaction with them. Or panpsychism, that there's some element of consciousness at the base of all physical systems. Or even idealism, that the whole world is itself a construct of consciousness. So that's one set of options. Another set of options is that consciousness is reducible, perhaps to some kind of computational or functional process, as popular functionalist views hold, perhaps to something really distinctively biological. That's biological materialism. Some people have even speculated maybe there's something essentially quantum mechanical about consciousness. We can reduce it to some kind of quantum materialism. And there's been a big debate about these options here in both the metaphysics and the science of consciousness. But here I'm not going to be concerned with either of those. Instead, I'm going to be taking a third approach. The third approach is to do what Douglas Hofstadter called jumping out of the system and going meta. So instead of trying to solve the problem, we ask instead, why is it that we think that consciousness poses a problem? And when you ask the question in this way, I think it just gives you just a different angle on the problem that comes with all kinds of promising new directions. One way to get at this is to look at various behavioral functions that are closely related to the hard problem. I mean, the hard problem is about experience, not about behavior, but there are behavioral functions that are very closely connected, not least that we make what I'll call phenomenal reports, or reports of conscious experience. Oh dear, I hope that's not ominous. Great. Yeah, perfect. These objective function, which is closely related to consciousness, is the existence of phenomenal reports or verbal reports of conscious experiences. People say things like, I am conscious. There's something it's like to be me. I am feeling pain now, and so on. And although consciousness itself may be a hard problem, it looks like these reports are in the vicinity of objective functions, potentially explicable by the standard mechanisms of cognitive science. So in principle, explaining those falls under the category of the easy problems. Oh, sorry, next one. Then we also have what I call problem reports, which are reports that consciousness seems like peculiarly mysterious or difficult to explain. Sorry, can we go back one to the one that says problem reports? Perfect. Reports expressing our sense that consciousness poses a hard problem. Maybe it's a slightly smaller group now, but there are at least some people out there who say things like, boy, it's really disturbing seeing yourself like that from the side. Yeah, right. Yeah. Super meta. Self-consciousness upon self-consciousness. And who is that zombie David Chalmers who's underneath? That's really worrying. There is a hard problem of consciousness. People say things like explaining behavior doesn't explain consciousness. Oh, fantastic. Thanks. Sorry about that. Consciousness seems non-physical and so on. Again, those things are behaviors, in principle, open to paradigmatic cognitive science explanation. So the meta problem of consciousness, as I understand it, is basically the problem of explaining those problem reports. In principle, puzzle about behavior So it's an easy problem, ought to be open to standard kinds of functional explanation. So the meta problem is an easy problem, but it's closely tied to the hard problem. In some ways it looks more tractable than the hard problem. And solving it ought to at least shed some light on the hard problem. If you like, this is a kind of potentially what people call a genealogical approach to, to philosophical problems. We don't exactly try and solve the problem directly, but we look at why it is that this problem exists in the first place. Sometimes people do this by focusing on cultural history, or maybe some kind of evolutionary history. For example, you might take this. Some people take this approach to God. Instead of trying to figure out is there a God, figure out why do we think there's a God in the first place. Sometimes if you find some evolutionary or cultural explanation of why we think there's a God, some people then think, okay, that actually debunks the existence of God. We no longer have strong reason to believe in God after we've explained why we have these beliefs. That much is controversial, but it's quite common to take this line about consciousness. And at least in recent years, a few people have taken it. And this leads to the view sometimes called Illusionism, that consciousness, or at least the problem of consciousness, is an illusion. We believe that we have these special properties that pose a problem, but we don't really explain why we have those beliefs, and we might dissolve the problem. So that's to say that solving the meta problem could dissolve the hard problem. And in recent years, that's actually become quite a popular view that started to receive some systematic attention. Here's a book that focused on a central paper by Keith Frankish called Illusionism as the Theory of Consciousness, depicting the mind-body problem as some kind of magic trick. We all seem to ourselves to have these magical properties that, in fact, we don't. In fact, illusionism has a long history in philosophy. So Immanuel Kant, in the Critique of Pure Reason, talked about some elements of the unity of self as a transcendental illusion. The materialist philosopher U.T. Place, who identified mental states with brain states, said, we have this sense there's something more, but he said it was a kind of phenomenological fallacy. Another Australian philosopher, David Armstrong, talked about a distinctive kind of illusion tied to a circus illusion called the Headless woman illusion. I'll get to that shortly. More recently, Dan Dennett has talked about consciousness as a user illusion. Keith Frankish, I mentioned already. Michael Graziano, the psychologist, has something he calls the attention schema theory, that we have all these schemas for thinking about the mind, self-models that drive us astray. So it's a popular and important view. I don't think, though, so many illusionists have a special motivation to be interested in the meta problem. But I think, I'm not myself an illusionist, I think the meta problem is interesting even independently of being an illusionist. I'm what philosophers call a realist about consciousness. We're in philosophy, to a first approximation, to be a realist about something is roughly to believe it's real. So a moral realist is someone who thinks morality is real. A realist about consciousness thinks consciousness is real. I think consciousness is not an illusion. I don't think that solving the meta problem suddenly dissolves the hard problem. But nonetheless, I think the meta problem is interesting in its own right. I think it's tractable, and that solving it has the potential to, at the very least, shed much light on the hard problem, even if it doesn't constitute a solution in its own right. And I think there's actually a research program here, what I'll call the meta problem research program, which I think is a potentially very productive one. It's open to realists and illusionists alike to try and solve the meta problem, try and explain these problem reports. It's open to reductionists and non-reductionists, illusionists and non-illusionists. We can try and solve the meta problem and then think about the philosophical consequences. One reason why I think this meta problem program is cool is that it comes with a fairly clear program in both philosophy and cognitive science. Remember, the problem was basically, really we might put this as to explain certain intuitions we have. It's really to explain certain reports, but maybe some underlying intuitions, or maybe to explain why it's possible to explain these intuitions. Yeah, this actually brings in, I think, a number of different areas of cognitive science. Really, at the core, I mean, it's the problem of consciousness. You might think it kind of comes from a philosophical background as the mind-body problem, a problem in metaphysics. What is the nature of the mind? The nature of consciousness. But by focusing on the meta-problem, this at least carves off a bit of the problem that comes with a tractable program in cognitive science. So one thing we want to do, I think, first is to distinguish a bunch of different problem reports or problem intuitions that people often display that lead people to think that are associated with there being a problem of consciousness. And I divide these into at least 4 groups. There are metaphysical intuitions, intuitions to the effect that consciousness seems somehow to be non-physical. There are explanatory intuitions tied to this, this core idea that consciousness is hard to explain. Explaining these objective functions doesn't explain consciousness. There are knowledge intuitions. Here the paradigmatic one would be Frank Jackson's classic case of Mary, the scientist who was brought up in a black and white room, knows all the physical facts about color processing in the brain and wavelengths and associations. But it seems she doesn't know one really important thing. She doesn't know what it's like to see red. One day she sees a red rose for the first time, and she learns something new. That's the knowledge intuition. And there are modal intuitions tied to what we can imagine or conceive, what seems possible. So, various philosophers, including me, have argued we can at least conceive of zombies, systems functionally, perhaps physically like us, but without consciousness. So these are some of the core intuitions associated with the problem of consciousness. There are some others too, maybe slightly less close to the core. There are intuitions about the distribution of consciousness, maybe that robots are not conscious or that groups are not conscious, for example. Intuitions about the value of consciousness, that consciousness matters morally. Actually, yesterday I was giving a talk which turned in central part on that kind of intuition. Intuitions about the self, that the self persists through time. Intuitions about the qualities presented in consciousness, the special quality, like the redness of red is somehow directly available to me. But I'll concentrate especially on the first 4. Now, I think one of the cool things about this meta-problem project is it comes with a very natural interdisciplinary research program. All kinds of work is potentially relevant here. There's experimental work in both experimental psychology and in what's called these days experimental philosophy, where you empirically study people's intuitions about these things. Here, particularly studying people's intuitions about consciousness and the associated problems. There's also, building of models, computational models, neurobiological models of intuitions and reports, and there's also a whole lot of room for philosophical analysis. So I think this, this meta-problem program is just ripe for interdisciplinary exploration, and it's been getting a bit of that in recent years. I mean, for starters, it's an empirical question how widely these intuitions are shared. In a paper I wrote on this maybe 4 years or so ago now, I argued they were going to be very widely shared, and you'd expect them to be, and not universal. Some people argued with that, and then there are actually begun to be some empirical studies of this. My own sense is that these intuitions one might expect to be quite widely shared, especially if one's a realist about consciousness. You might think, well, the source of these intuitions is going to be deeply tied to actually being conscious. Presumably being conscious is something that's universal, at least if one's a realist. So at least that source of the intuitions should be widely shared. Maybe it doesn't actually lead to these intuitions in everybody, but you might think, okay, at the very least a tendency in that direction ought to be widely shared. A disposition to say these things, even if it's sometimes overridden by other things in in any given system. I mean, the alternative view, though, is that they're somehow cultural and local. Maybe Descartes, René Descartes gets blamed for a lot of stuff in philosophy and cognitive science. Maybe these mind-body intuitions are all Descartes' fault. I find that very deeply implausible myself, but then maybe I would, given that I have these intuitions very strongly. But I do think this is an empirical question. Traditionally, I think in the last couple of decades of cognitive science, there's been a fair amount of empirical work on intuitions about the mind, but that work concerns especially, I think, belief, like under what conditions infants have the concept of a false belief, intuitions about the self, like how selves persist over time, whether they might continue after death, and so on. Where consciousness is concerned, perhaps the biggest body of work has been on distribution of consciousness in robots and groups and so on. Josh Knobe has done some well-known work on those questions. Where problem intuitions are concerned, at least when I wrote this, when I first started writing about this 4 or 5 years ago, there wasn't so much. Now there's come to at least be a small literature experimentally studying these intuitions. In something I wrote, I said the intuition I would expect to be most robust and widespread is the intuition about Mary in the black and white room, not knowing what it's like to see red, and then learning something. Just recently, Daniel Gregory and a couple of other philosophers have published a very nice experimental study of this called "Who Knows What Mary Knew?" And they find that, they asked the question, did Mary know what it's like to see red? When she had that complete physical knowledge, but had not yet actually experienced the color, did Mary know what it's like to see red? 82% said no, she didn't. But then upon seeing it for the first time, did she then know what it's like to see red? 90% said yes. So okay, that's fairly robust. I mean, no one expects to get 100% on any of these things, but 80 to 90% indicates some pretty serious effect. There are also explanatory intuitions. There's a nice paper by Sarah Gottlieb and Tanya Lombroso. It doesn't focus just on consciousness, but focuses on questions about under what conditions do people have the intuition that certain mental phenomena are hard to explain scientifically. And they find people seem to think that mental phenomena are especially hard to explain when they're tied to subjective experience and privileged awareness, which at least goes along with the idea there's some distinctive explanatory intuitions tied to the tied to the hardness of the hard problem for consciousness. More recently, there's an article by Rodrigo Diaz called "Do People Think Consciousness Poses a Hard Problem?" where he's actually trying to argue that these intuitions are not so widespread. And actually, there's a lot to say about this paper, which is very interesting. It turns out a whole lot depends on things like your preamble and your setting up of the problem. If you set it up with super like pro-science, neurobiology, then people say, okay, yeah, science is doing great. If you set it up with a lot of stuff about how consciousness is so mysterious, not so good. With a reasonably neutral setup, I think he gets about 50% of people saying consciousness is hard to explain, 50% not. So yeah, interesting to know what to make of this. It's hard to experimentally test a lot of these things because we have to use words like explanation, which are so ambiguous, and conceivability, which has got technical meanings and so on. So tricky, but at least I think the literature here at least is beginning to develop. Actually, I've done a tiny bit of empirical work about this myself. I'm not exactly an experimental philosopher, but every now and then I've taken empirical surveys of intuitions about philosophy, restricted to the class of professional philosophers. So David Bourget and I are independently, we co-developed a website, Phil Papers, which is basically a giant bibliography of philosophy, 2 million entries, and it's basically turned into a giant database of philosophy of all kinds. And along the way, this involved building a giant database of email addresses of all philosophers. So we found ourselves back in 2009 in a position to contact, I think, philosophers in 100 departments of philosophy around the world, and to ask them for their views on 30 key philosophical problems, like materialism, yes, no, other, with various other options. We did it again in 2020, this time with 100 questions and many more philosophers. And I think we asked 8,000 and got 2,000 responses. And one of the questions this time was, is there a hard problem of consciousness? And we found 62% of philosophers say yes, 30% say no. Okay, this is a rather selected and corrupted group that maybe doesn't reveal a whole lot about pre-theoretical intuitions, because philosophers have thought about this a lot. Still interesting data. There was among scientists, I don't know of an exact equivalent of the Phil Papers survey for surveying psychologists, neuroscientists, AI researchers in general, but I do know there was one survey back in 2018 of attendees at the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, where it's a majority neuroscientists and psychologists, with again 60% saying some kind of explanatory gap on explaining functional behavioral properties of things. And there's a gap to consciousness. Again, this group is selected for being interested in consciousness, so by no means like a pure sample of pre-theoretical intuitions, but interesting data all the same. There's obviously room for a lot more experimental work there, so I'm really trying to encourage this kind of experimental philosophy and psychology of intuitions about consciousness. I also want to say a bit about potential solutions to the problems, because this idea of explaining our intuitions has been around for a while. There are at least some kind of quasi-standard approaches here. I mean, this literature is extremely fragmented. I think at least until recently, there was just a proposal here and a proposal there that didn't really make contact with each other. But I think it's possible to systematize them. And I've tried to do this a little bit by looking at a few different factors that might be generating these intuitions about consciousness. And again, these moves are available equally to the illusionist, who thinks it's all an illusion, and the realist, who thinks all this is real. One key, very basic idea, Doug Hofstadter, I think, has argued for this kind of view at some length, and more recently Michael Graziano's theory is a version of this. Basically says it all comes down to certain internal self-models. We all have models of ourselves, in particular models of our own cognitive processes. And these models can greatly distort the real thing. Sometimes they greatly simplify the real thing. Sometimes they add to the real thing. They needn't exactly they didn't represent the real thing perfectly. But these introspective models will somehow explain our sense that we're conscious and that there's a problem of consciousness. And that much I find quite plausible, but now the question is how? What kind of introspective models are going to do this? Well, here's a Escher print that Hofstadter uses to somehow explain the idea that our wonky self-models somehow lead to the existence of the problem represented by the big hole at the center where nothing makes sense. A related idea is this idea, often associated with David Armstrong, of introspective opacity. And here the key idea is, well, we don't see that consciousness is physical. Introspection is opaque as to the underlying mechanisms. It doesn't show us the underlying mechanisms of consciousness. We don't see that consciousness is physical, and then we go on to infer, we go on to see it as non-physical. And this is meant to have some analogs with this circus illusion of the headless person. We don't see their head, so we see them as having no head. Here's a picture of the so-called headless woman illusion, which was, I guess, popular in 19th century circuses. And there's just, there's someone sitting there with her head behind a screen. And I guess the idea is that under the right conditions, at least for a moment, you look at this, it's like, oh my God, that person has no head. I don't know how much the perceptual system really gets taken in by this. But maybe there are circumstances where it looks a little bit like that. I do think, it takes special circumstances to get this going. I can block out the heads of a few of you, and it doesn't suddenly look like there's a bunch of headless people in the audience. So I think you only actually make this inference under certain very special conditions. So I think that itself needs explaining. There's also further questions like, why doesn't introspection of, say, belief and other mental states generate the same gap? Indeed, even for our awareness of, say, of computers and algorithms, I know my iPhone is running some kind of computation under the surface when I use this, but I've got no idea. I mean, for most of us, it's totally, who knows what's going on there? I guess it's some kind of silicon circuits, but we've got no awareness of that. We've got no awareness of the physical processes underneath all this, but it doesn't mean that we suddenly have some sense that it's non-physical. So I think this explanation overgeneralizes, even though there may be something to it. One idea is that color experience and other kinds of experiences may attribute certain kinds of primitive qualities to objects. So you look at that red exit sign and so on. What's actually going on in nature is some very complex reflectance property out there, but we model it as this very simple primitive feature of redness in the world. It's a primitive quality instantiated out there in the world, and that makes maybe for some very simple model of things in the world is having these different primitive colors, likewise for yellow and the like. In some other work, I've thought of this as like modeling the external world as a kind of a Garden of Eden with all these primitive qualities exactly as they appear to us in perception. And that Edenic world could at least serve as a useful model of the complex, non-Edenic world that we live in. So maybe then the thought is maybe something like that's going on in the mind. Maybe to model the mind, we also attribute primitive qualities to the mind, the same way we attribute primitive qualities to the world. I'm not sure yet that gets at the key issue, though, which is tied to our experience or our awareness of qualities. And I think to get to that, you really need to go beyond this to, well, a sense of being related to these qualities in the world, of being aware of them. And maybe in particular, our internal models give us a sense of being acquainted both with concrete qualities and with our awareness of them, which I think is getting closer to the heart of the matter. But as with all these explanations, it always just keeps pushing back the question a bit for me. Okay, but how and why does that work? So if I was kind of to put all this together into a summary, here's like my summary of one possible approach or potential beginning of a solution sketch to the meta problem. Why do we have this sense there's a problem of consciousness? One thing I like, by the way, about this kind of summary is you can either read this in a realist tone of voice from the point of view of someone who thinks consciousness is real and these are the mechanisms, or in a illusionist tone of voice, where this is an account of the illusion. I think the kind of explanation I'm giving here is neutral on that. You just say, okay, we have introspective models deploying introspective concepts of our internal states that are largely independent of our physical concepts. These concepts are introspectively opaque, not revealing any of the underlying mechanisms. Our perceptual models perceptually attribute primitive perceptual qualities to the world, and our introspective models attribute primitive mental relations to these qualities. These models produce the sense of acquaintance both with those qualities and with our awareness of those qualities. I guess I'm inclined to find something like this somewhat plausible as an account of what's going into the intuitions. At the same time, it feels to me less like an explanation of the intuitions and more like a kind of a fleshing out of what the intuitions are. What I'd really like to see is some kind of story of maybe some kind of algorithmic basis for the intuitions where things went this way and where, if you actually built that algorithm, you would see it displaying the relevant intuitions. I mean, one way we can test solutions to the meta problem is by, trying to formulate them maybe in some kind of algorithmic terms, test those explanations with psychological studies and computational models. I mean, the only thing in this direction I really know so far is something by Luc Mühlhauser and Bach Schlageris, where they took some fairly simple ideas about the meta problem that the philosopher Francois Cameron and I had put forward, and they tried to build in those ideas into a little software agent, which they gave a bunch of axioms and the ability to derive conclusions from those axioms and a few basic principles about consciousness as the axioms. And they actually found it produced little theorems, little reports like, yeah, consciousness, my experience of red, distinct from any brain process, and so on. Okay, which is promising and interesting, although I think it's very much a toy model, and they do build quite a lot into this model. Interesting question: if a machine issues the same sort of problem reports as us, and caused by similar mechanisms that we think are present in us, should we take that actually as evidence that the machine is conscious? Here a few people have suggested that you could actually potentially use problem reports as a sort of Turing test for machine consciousness. Aaron Sloman, Susan Schneider, Ed Turner have said, one way to test whether a machine is conscious is to see whether it is puzzled about consciousness. If it says, well, I know I'm just a bunch of silicon chips, but I feel subjectively like so much more, then is that some kind of sign that it might actually be conscious? On the other hand, you might say, the machine might say, damn, why do I need to be so theoretically confused as those damn humans? It's like in the regular Turing test, the poor machine has to drag itself down to talk like a dumb human being. Here's the poor sad machine studying the talk like a human test preparation book. Likewise for the meta problem, it's like, okay, why do I really need to have confused intuitions about consciousness as the humans do? But if it did display those intuitions, though, maybe that would be some evidence. I was going to say something about impact on theories of consciousness, although maybe I think I'll skip over this for reasons of time. Here the idea is, from a realist perspective, a solution to the meta problem and a solution to the hard problem might be closely connected. And we could use this as a kind of test for theories of consciousness. See, whatever explains consciousness should also partly explain our judgments about consciousness. And here the idea is, it would be strange if the basis of consciousness played no role at all in judgments about consciousness. And here I go on to argue that some theories of consciousness, don't seem to pass this test, that the mechanisms of consciousness explain the judgments about consciousness. I argue, for example, that Tononi's integrated information theory has trouble meeting this challenge. But maybe I'll skip over that for reasons of time. So just to conclude, I'll end just by saying something a little bit about this underlying issue between the realist and the illusionist about consciousness. The illusionist says consciousness doesn't exist. We just think it does. A solution to the meta problem dissolves the hard problem. Strong illusionism says phenomenal consciousness does not exist at all. This is a very attractively austere view of consciousness. Its main problem is it seems somehow impossible to believe. Here's one way to put the argument against it as just a flat-footed argument. It's like, people sometimes feel pain. If strong illusionism is true, no one feels pain. Therefore, strong illusionism is false. And here the underlying idea is, well, it's just a datum that we have certain kinds of conscious experiences, like feeling pain, experiencing red. You might put this in some neutral form. It's like, well, it's unbelievable. It's just impossible to believe illusionism, because it's somehow unbelievable that no one feels pain and that no one is conscious. So illusionism is unbelievable. Now, the illusionist does themselves have an interesting reply here, which is, my view predicts that my view is unbelievable. It's just those models you have in your brain that forces you to think you're conscious, and that consciousness can't be an illusion, but it might still be wrong. So just to conclude then, one way of putting this kind of illusionist, realist showdown is between two different forms of absurdity, two different kinds of claims about absurdity. Here's the philosopher Galen Strawson saying, illusionism is absurd. There occurred in the 20th century the most remarkable episode in the whole history of ideas. A number of thinkers denied the existence of something we know with certainty to exist, namely consciousness. Okay, so it's the most absurd thing he's ever heard. Here on the other side is the rationalist philosopher Eliezer Yudkowsky, arguing that epiphenomenalism is absurd. And here this was something he wrote engaging with some of my ideas in my book, The Conscious Mind, where I talked about zombies. He says, the zombie argument may be a candidate for the most deranged idea in all of philosophy. The causally closed cognitive system of Chalmers' internal narrative is malfunctioning in a way that, not by necessity, but just in our universe, miraculously happens to be correct. And here, I mean, this is getting an interesting idea, which is if you're a realist about consciousness, maybe not just an epiphenomenalist, but a realist more generally, somehow it looks like you can explain all those things we say without mentioning consciousness. So somehow the fact that the things we say are actually true ends up being kind of a remarkable coincidence. So realism ends up being absurd too. There is middle ground here, of course, between those extreme views. I think it tends to slide back to the same problems. Other forms of illusionism don't help with the hard problem. Other forms of realism are still subject to the miraculous correctness or the idea that they're merely true by coincidence. So I think to get beyond absurdity here, I think there's challenges for both sides. The illusionist needs to explain how having a mind can be somehow like this, even if it's not completely the way that it seems. The realist needs to explain, to avoid this coincidence worry, the realist needs to explain how meta-problem processes are essentially grounded in consciousness, even if it's possible for them to occur without consciousness. But either way, I mean, if we can get a solution to the meta-problem that meets these ambitions, that may just possibly lead to a solution to the hard problem of consciousness. In the meantime, I think the meta-problem is a potentially tractable research project for everyone. Thank you. 2 to spare, very good.
We'll now have some time for Q&A, moderated by Professor Schultz.
We have 10 to 15 minutes for questions for Professor Chalmers, after which he will be visiting the Metaphysics Meets Cognitive Science course. Who has some questions about consciousness? Who has some meta questions? Anyone?
I'll start things off. In your slide where you kind of summarize the view that you were developing, I actually just had a question about the interpretation of that text, and so I wanted to ask you about that.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for going back to that. Yes, so you say our perceptual models perceptually attribute primitive perceptual qualities to the world. And I just didn't understand that phrase. This is legitimate. If you could say a little bit more about what you mean by perceptual attribution and primitive perceptual qualities. And then I had a secondary question, which is I don't really know what you mean by the sense of acquaintance. So I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Okay, so the perceptual models and the primitive perceptual qualities was meant to be a version of, this thing, like the intuitions grounded in color experience that somehow, in perceptions, like redness just seems to be this kind of this primitive quality of objects. That redness is kind of spread out over the exit sign. It seems to be this, this very distinctive, shiny quality out there. As far as perception is concerned, it seems to be basically a primitive thing. There's red and there's green, and maybe there's amounts of redness and amounts of blueness that we can decompose phenomenologically. But it certainly doesn't seem to be a complex property or a reducible property. So many people have made this point about the phenomenology of color, that in seeing a color, the world seems to be populated by these special primitive qualities. And I think something similar might go for pitch. You can argue about space, but at least for color. Are you uncomfortable with that much?
I see. I mean, part of what I was puzzled about was, there's also, say, the way that Brian would describe perception, and it would be a little bit different. So I'm trying to kind of put this together.
So this is very much from the phenomenological perspective. This is kind of how perception seems. It seems to attribute these primitive qualities to things in the world.
And then with the coins, I find it very difficult to try to talk about this in a way that it's like I get it intuitively, but then how to express it in language is very hard. So what do you mean? What is acquaintance here, and what does it do?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the basic idea is we seem to stand in a particularly direct epistemological relation to these properties, both the properties in the world, the redness out there. I think phenomenologically it seems that there's some redness out there, and it seems that I'm in very direct contact with it. I mean, exactly what nature that contact has is, you can argue about that. But, people have the catapult theories and the intromission theories, and I don't know. But also, I think even more when it comes to consciousness itself, to my, my awareness of that redness, my experience, there's this idea that we have some kind of direct acquaintance with what it's like to be us. Maybe more primitive than any conceptual grasp. It's just that those properties are somehow, phenomenologically, it feels like, phenomenal properties are just there for us. When Mary sees red for the first time, she becomes acquainted with a certain kind of experience that she hadn't had before. Now, maybe that intuition is wrong, but I think it is I don't know that it's a direct phenomenological intuition. I mean, acquaintance is kind of a technical term. This is already getting a little bit theoretical, so think of it maybe more as something which just lies behind some of our more surface intuitions as a potentially unifying explainer of them, the sense of acquaintance.
Oh, I see it. I will follow on some class here.
Yeah, I know you yourself.
Thanks.
Hello. I know you're not an illusionist yourself, but I kind of wanted to clarify that idea. Normally with skepticism, there's kind of this gap between what is and what we perceive. So if I'm a skeptic, I perceive a table here, but how do I know that there actually is a table if there's nothing? With illusionism, how can there be a gap between kind of what we think and what we think? To me, I'm kind of on the this is absurd camp, and I think there's probably a more charitable explanation.
Yeah, I mean, certainly many people have accused the view of being somehow contradictory or self-undermining. I think one way to put it is here, the strong illusionism is contradictory, because you might think that the illusion itself, to undergo an illusion, is itself a kind of conscious experience. So you're saying you're conscious. Yeah, well, you're not actually conscious. You merely have the illusion of consciousness. Well, if we understood that as requiring the conscious experience that you are conscious, then that would seem to be contradictory. So I think the illusionists would better understand illusions here as something that doesn't require consciousness. I mean, maybe it could be something analogous to, say, unconscious perception. But maybe another way to think about it is this is something that goes on at the level of judgment. We've got things we perceive to be the case and things we judge to be the case. And maybe on some views, judgment is a conscious act, or very often a conscious act. But I think the thought is there's an analog of judgment, a kind of mental act of taking something to be the case that needn't actually be conscious. So maybe think of this as a non-conscious judgment that we are conscious. And even maybe an AI system. Think about an AI system that goes around building these weird representations of itself as having these special properties. No one's inclined to say the AI system is conscious, but it seems to at the very least be producing the reports that they're conscious. I mean, at the very least, think of the judgment as a disposition to report. Then at least we've escaped the charge, hopefully, of contradiction. Does that help?
Thank you. Just also a purely clarifying question. Can you say a little bit more about what the coincidence is that all realists and not only epiphenomenalists are meant to have to explain? I didn't really understand what the accusation is from the illusionist side.
This was about acquaintance specifically?
Sorry, the coincidence.
Coincidence. Oh, yeah, you're right. I didn't really say nearly enough about that. I think here's one idea. Just say there's an algorithmic explanation of why we say the things we say about consciousness. But there's no algorithmic explanation of consciousness. Consciousness is something super-algorithmic, as many realists think. And you might think, well, that's at least an uncomfortable explanation, because it starts to look as if our judgments about consciousness are made almost independently of consciousness itself. And then you go on to say, well, but actually, there are these properties of consciousness over and above the algorithm, and the algorithm is getting them right. When it says, I'm having that red experience, I'm having experiences structured a certain way, that's all going on, and it starts to look like, boy, it's really lucky that, that we actually got these things right, because it looks like, well, that algorithm could have gone on without consciousness, it could have gone on with different consciousness. Maybe the psychophysical laws, the laws connecting algorithms and consciousness are such that at least most of the time, that's going to be right. But even then, it starts to look like, boy, lucky that we live in a world where the psychophysical laws connect up the algorithms to consciousness that way. So I get something like that as a thought. I don't intend it to be conclusive. I think there are lots of things to say in reply, and I've heard people say interesting things in reply. But I do feel that's, for me, that's perhaps the most forceful objection to realism about consciousness.
Hi. I noticed that you said something about how the problem reports are kind of evidence, or it seemed like you were implying that they're kind of evidence not only that consciousness exists, but also that it has a tangible, noticeable effect on the world that we perceive. And I was wondering, what are your thoughts on like arguments about how evolutionary function could, like why would it be beneficial for an organism to evolve to not only present the information that it experiences to the conscious processes of if consciousness is a physical process, why would it present it to that in an organized way? And then why would it listen for a response from the conscious process and then allow that to affect the world in an organized way?
So what would be the evolutionary benefit of?
Like, why would it be beneficial for an organism to evolve so that it not only like responds to phenomena outside, but it also delivers it to this mysterious consciousness phenomenon and then listens? I'm not so much just asking this question, I'm just asking like, what do you think of those arguments? Do you think that they hold water? Do you think they limit it in some way?
I don't have any good story to tell about the evolutionary benefits of consciousness itself. This is one of the deepest mysteries in the field. Anything you might posit, we need consciousness for that, looks like in principle. It's hard to see why you couldn't do that without consciousness. On the other hand, where the meta problem is concerned, maybe there's something interesting we can say about why there are evolutionary benefits in having a model of consciousness that attributes these special properties of consciousness to you. I mean, I think of this, just start, say, with the color case. Why might it be useful to have some kind of model of colors as these primitive things in the world? Maybe, which in the model doesn't build in these complex reflectance properties that exist in reality. Well, we don't need all that complexity just to make these distinctions. It just turns out, well, it's really useful to be able to, distinguish certain kinds of, fruits from others, and certain kinds of physical objects from others, and these are attributing these primitive qualities is just a really good way to do that. Likewise, when it comes to, you can easily tell a story about why it's useful for us to have a model of our own mind, and to have a model indeed of other people's minds. And then, at least with a bit of hand waving, you can tell some story about why it might actually be useful to say, instead of saying we've got these really complex causal representational relations to things in the world, it's like, no, we have the simple relation of consciousness to those qualities. Now, I don't have a detailed version of that story. People like Graziano and Nick Humphrey have tried to sketch versions of stories like that. I think there's at least an interesting research program there of looking at the benefits of self-models with certain properties that may be, for example, socially useful in dealing with other people. We have to communicate our states of mind with each other. Having a kind of, maybe certain kinds of self-models involving models of consciousness can help.
I was wondering if you differentiate between consciousness-related and consciousness-independent sources of problem intuitions. I was reading the paper that talked about that, and I was confused about how any of these intuitions that presumably come from our conscious mind could be truly independent of consciousness.
Yeah, I think what I actually say in the paper is I want them to be topic neutral. That is, I don't want these explanations to mention consciousness anywhere. If they mention consciousness, then they're no longer going to be neutral between the illusionist and the realist. But I do think it's true that at least a realist is going to look at some of the things I say here and say all those things are consequences of consciousness. Why do we have these introspective models deploying introspective concepts? Because we're conscious. And we're acquainted with consciousness and whatever, and that's what actually gives us the models and the concepts. Why do our models perceptually attribute these qualities? Because there really are these qualities, at least in the mind. We really are acquainted with consciousness. So I think that a realist can say that this topic neutral explanation is in fact dependent on consciousness. On the other hand, the illusionist, I think, can hopefully endorse this without saying any of it is dependent on consciousness. Say we somehow come to have these introspective models without consciousness, we have this sense of acquaintance without consciousness, but somehow all that gives us the sense that we're conscious. So I guess, yeah, the rule is not that this has to be consciousness independent in the sense that it's not actually grounded in consciousness. But maybe it's meant to be at least an explanation that one can grasp without it somehow immediately entailing or requiring the existence of consciousness, if that makes sense. But yeah, there's probably a few different notions of consciousness dependence here that I could probably be more careful about separating.
I think we have time for one more question before David has to head upstairs to the seminar, and it will be you.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a question about emergentism. In the study of complex systems, for example, neuroscience, one of the common theme is that you can never explain the property of complex collective systems from the single constituents. For example, memory and learning, those complex functions can only emerge from the complex interaction or dynamics between the groups. So I will ask, do you think the way Mary sees color is one of those emergent properties that cannot be explained by the simple materials?
Yeah, I think it is fairly plausible that consciousness emerges from brain processes somehow, but I think this word emergence kind of covers up a variety of sins. You know, it's like, sometimes I say it's like a magic word that people use to make them feel better about things they don't understand. It's like, you know, the key question is, how does it emerge and why? Philosophers sometimes distinguish strong emergence from weak emergence. Strong emergence involves something fundamentally new. Weak emergence is more like what you get, say, in nonlinear systems. You know, the game of life, it follows a few very simple rules at the bottom level, and at the higher levels, yeah, some really surprising things happen. But in those cases, it looks like the surprising things, they're surprising, but they're not too surprising in the sense that if you actually work through the lower level processes carefully, you can tell some pretty straightforward story about how it is that all those rules come together and they'll generate the high level phenomena, say, of, I don't know, life or of behavior of complex cellular entities. So that's weak emergence. And in those cases, actually, but what needed explaining was still something much closer to the easy problems, you know, some complicated functional things that a system does, and yeah, surprisingly, some simple mechanisms can do that. Nothing like that seems to work, I think, for consciousness. It doesn't seem to just be a matter of, oh my God, it's somewhat surprising, but in principle, if you work through it enough, you can see how this would come out. I mean, the gap seems of a somewhat different character here. You know, it just seems like a different kind of thing you're trying to explain, not one of those objective functions. And because of that, you know, the gap seems to be much more principled. And this leads to it being a case of what philosophers call strong emergence. And yeah, if it's strong emergence, then the question is, well, now it's something fundamentally new, maybe involving fundamentally new properties in nature. Now it starts to look like a version of what philosophers call property dualism, which I think is okay, and that's also a possibility. But insofar as many people want to use emergence to kind of support a materialist view, come on, it's just another emergent property like life or like the weather. Then I think that will only work if it's weak emergence. Not, if that's meant to support a materialist reduction, that will only work if it's weak emergence. But I think that's less plausible in the case of consciousness.
Okay, everybody, we are in an awkward position now because we have already applauded for these excellent ideas that David has shared with us, and it would be sort of weird to just do that again. So let us go meta and applaud David for handling the questions and the organization of these ideas in his house.
I applaud your applause.